just to identify the area we're talking about. Um, we have, for the most part, we divide the eastern seaboard, the Atlantic seaboard, into three different regions, and we haven't really discussed the development of New England yet, and we haven't discussed the development of the Anglo-South yet, Virginia Tidewater and the Carolinas. So today we're talking about the area that is located in between New England and the South. And just to get you started, we know that the British would later claim the uh, the eastern seaboard, right? And that would be a matter of two private companies working out of England. One was called the Virginia Company, and the other was called what? The Virginia Company, all right? So there was one that was called the Virginia Company of London, all right, and one called the Virginia Company of Plymouth. And the Virginia Company of London would essentially wind up getting a claim to the area that we would refer to as the Chesapeake and the Tidewater, for the most part, this zone here. So the Virginia Company of London would eventually settle the Virginia Tidewater area. The other company, the Virginia Company of Plymouth, would wind up settling colonists in the Massachusetts Bay area. And they would have claim to this zone here. Now, in between those two companies' claims given by the English Crown was an overlapping zone. And so both companies had claim, because of their charters, they had claim to that middle zone. And because of that, they avoided it. They generally avoided it. So we have the emergence in 1608 of the 1607, 1608, the colonization at Jamestown, which would eventually grow by the mid-1650s into this early tidewater settlement based in a staple agricultural production of tobacco. And in the north, we would have the settlement not for economic purposes, not for sort of making money so much as settling families, Puritans and separatists and religious refugees who settled as families. So eventually we'll have two very different English populations, one where we have a family-oriented settlement with a balanced gender ratio that would increase rapidly. However, they would be hemmed in for the most part without very good agricultural prospects. And here we have the movement of mostly male population during the 17th century, and the establishment of a very lucrative tobacco staple production economy. And that would, of course, eventually change over to a slave-based economy in the 18th century. But for the most part, the 17th century would be an indentured servant economy. We'll talk about that later. But that zone in between was a sort of a no man's land, because both companies generally stayed in that area that they had clear claim to. And that opened up settlement, opened up the area to other groups. And the groups we'll talk about today include the Dutch and the Swedes. And later, we also include in the Midland area another group of English colonists who were private in terms of their approach, or his approach, and would also bring in religious refugees, essentially. Okay, so this area in between, now if we were to skip ahead into the 18th century and even the early 19th century, where we stopped this course, the area that we were referring to is the cultural hearth of what we call the Midland region of the United States. And here in Oklahoma, we are most of the settlers who arrived into Oklahoma after, well, illegally after about 1870 and legally after 1889. Most of the people who arrived to Oklahoma had their cultural roots in this zone that we call the Midland. Some people came from the Middle West, and some people came from the Upland South. There were also some people who arrived from the lower South into Oklahoma, but for the most part, the majority of Oklahomans, whether they're from the Middle West in northern and northwestern Oklahoma, or if they arrived into Indian Territory earlier, they generally came from the Upland South. So this is sort of in many ways, the cultural hearth or the cultural region that Oklahoma belongs to way on down the line. So we're going to talk about the development of a cultural hearth that we refer to as a Middle Atlantic cultural hearth. And it developed between those two English zones early on in the 17th century. So let's get some base level knowledge going here. What states would you generally associate with the Middle Atlantic region, the Middle Atlantic states? What are they? Well, we know New England, is very distinctive. Basically, New England's states today are clearly outside of the Middle Atlantic. If we go back to a map, this map is, I don't know, this map is not mine, but it's not the greatest. I would generally say that Massachusetts and Connecticut and Rhode Island are clearly New England states, as are Vermont and New Hampshire, and of course Maine was part of Massachusetts. So this is all New England. Now, New Englanders would eventually settle most of upstate New York, but I like to include the Middle Atlantic. The Middle Atlantic region would include New York City, which therefore includes parts of Long Island, but definitely New York City and all of New Jersey and Pennsylvania. So the Middle Atlantic, for the most part, has two different culture hearts. So this is not a good map to be discussing this, but New York City and the Philadelphia areas are the two primary cultural hearths for the Middle Atlantic region. Okay. Now, Long Island would be settled by English Puritans out of Connecticut and Rhode Island, but mostly out of New Haven, Connecticut. And so today, Long Island, New York has a distinctive New England landscape and culture. So that's a little bit different, even though Long Island is, technically part of New York. But the Hudson Valley of New York is that area that was colonized by the Dutch early on. We've talked about the relationship that the Dutch had with the Iroquois, and the Iroquois' relationships or contesting of the area of Canada with the French allied Indians. We talked about that last week. And this week we're going to talk a little bit more about this zone and how different it was. So let's look at some more questions. The states associated, okay, so basically New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, okay? Those are about the most important areas we'll talk about. These are powers, European powers who preceded the English in this zone. The Dutch preceded the English in terms of settlement. And the Dutch were quite different in that the Dutch were more cosmopolitan. So these are the general ideas that I want you to get out of this. The Dutch were more cosmopolitan. They were more interested in establishing trade relationships across the Atlantic and making New York or New Amsterdam an important commercial hub. They were not agricultural settlers in the same way that the English were. They they were similar to the French and similar to some English groups later, and perhaps the Spanish, in that they also transferred, or they attempted to transfer, a feudalistic system of land tenure from the Low Countries, from Holland to the New World. We'll talk about that. Um, they were also uh, they were unable to bring in huge numbers of settlers. Okay, so those are some of the generalities that we need to cover. What attracted these European groups to this place? Largely it was the fur trade. The fur trade established the Dutch and the Swedes in two estuary zones, and I'll talk about the physical geography in a minute. They arrived for the most part in the 1630s, 1640s, 1650s. Not a long period of colonization, but early enough to establish a hold and to establish a pattern of settlement and a system of settlement. They got along better with the indigenous populations in the Hudson Valley and the Delaware Valley, and this would also go for the proprietary colony of Pennsylvania later. They got along a little bit better with the native peoples in this area than the English did in New England or the English did in Virginia. So I'll say that, and I'll try to explain how a little bit. It was much like the French relationship in that they were mostly interested in the fur trade and not so much in expansion of colonies into territories. What did they contribute to U.S. regional culture? This is a big one. The Dutch and the Swedes and the people who the Swedes brought in to the Delaware Valley had a very significant yet largely unappreciated impact on the future of the expansion of the United States. And I'll try to explain how. I may not do that today, but I may do that online later. Okay. So, and when did the English take over? I'll let you answer that one. When did the English take over? When did New Amsterdam become New York, and when did New Netherland become New York? In the 1650s. In fact, what happened was the English took over initially in mid-1650s. They only held it for a little bit. The Dutch took over again, and then the English came back and took it permanently. So anyway, that's just sort of the sequence. And you can read your section in Richard Nostrand's textbook on the Hudson and see the sequence. And it's not really so important about the dates, but one thing, when the English did take over in the Hudson Valley, the English were wise enough not to expel the Dutch, not to expel the colonists who had already been there, and this was to their advantage. The Dutch, like the French in, say, the lower Mississippi Valley, would continue to have a lot of influence and would often run the trade relationships. So the Dutch would remain very, very significant, even though the imperial powers would change over. So that's all I need to say about that. Is that the English didn't expel these landowners; they just allowed them to continue, and they allowed them to eventually assimilate into the larger Atlantic seaboard. Now, one of the contributions that this area had on American culture and American historical geography is that the middle Atlantic states, unlike New England, unlike the Virginia Tidewater, and to a degree the Carolinas, were very, very culturally diverse in terms of their European settler makeup. So lots of different groups arrived into New York City. New York City was incredibly, for Atlantic seaboard, in Atlantic seaboard terms, New York City was the most cosmopolitan area. Of course, it still is, but it was the area that was attracted, that attracted people who were involved in the fur trade, but also connected to other parts of Europe, not just New Amsterdam. You have to remember also that the Dutch, before the English, the Dutch were the first real European capitalist power. And by capitalism, I mean the idea that you would uh, take, that wealthy people would invest in the future development of a place. They would invest in business activities with the intent of gaining profits over the long term. So the Dutch were investors. The Dutch were interested in not just not just this part of the Atlantic seaboard. They were all over the world, but the Dutch were investing commercially in the expansion of the Atlantic seaboard, not even just in the Hudson Valley either. So that's important. The commercial focus of the Dutch made the Hudson Valley an attractive area for any particular group who were interested in commerce and trade. The English would later adopt the same idea, set of ideas, that they would become what we would call economic liberals. They would do their best to allow capitalism to flourish. In Pennsylvania, we have something even more interesting, at least I think it is, and that is in Pennsylvania is when we begin to get the very first non-English speaking settler population, that is, groups of families who would arrive. And this would come about more in the early 18th century, the early 1700s, as a German and Swiss group would begin to arrive into Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania gets established in the early 1680s by William Penn, and William Penn has a very interesting history himself. He was a member of the Roundheads, the parliamentarians during the English Civil War. So that's another important facet of colonization of the English seaboard that we really haven't talked too much about. You may have read a little bit about it, but the English Civil War was it was very, very important to the patterns of migration and the political, sort of the political cultures of the English seaboard. The two groups in the English Civil War that you probably are familiar with are the parliamentarians, or the Protestant Puritans, and the Anglican, sometimes referred to as the Cavaliers, the loyal, those who were loyal to the crown and to the Church of England, the aristocracy particularly. But the Puritans and the Royalists, or the Cavaliers, were the two primary groups involved in the English Civil Wars. The English Civil War would eventually play out and be settled in 1688. And 1688 is a very, very important year in English history. What took place in 1688 that was so groundbreaking, so significant? Sir. The Glorious Revolution, great. And the Glorious Revolution of 1688 is after the English had claim New York. So what's significant about? Oh, okay, well I'll let you finish. I kind of interrupted you, I think. So that you're finished. Okay. Well, so who was the Dutch monarch? William of Orange. Okay, and uh, when William of Orange returned from the Netherlands, right, and took control, who was his wife? His queen, was it Mary? So we have today there in Virginia. There's a college called the College of William and Mary, right? William of Orange, William and Mary. So the Glorious Revolution was significant to English history in that it ended the tradition of um, what is it? Sorry, I'm really slow this morning. I guess it's Monday, right? It was that football game that wore me out. Okay. Um, the divine right of kings, okay? The divine right of kings was eliminated from English history. And so in 1688, what happens is Parliament gains really gains its status within the English Constitution. Now, we know what the United States Constitution is, right? It was written in the 1780s and ratified finally like in 1788, 1789. We have a document. You can go see it in Washington, D.C. at the National Archives. It's called the Constitution. Some of you have copies of the Constitution, right? The English Constitution, when people refer to the English Constitution doesn't exist as a document. It's a tradition. So people will refer to the Constitution in England that goes way back to the Magna Carta, right? So it's a tradition. It's not a single document. Now, going back to the Middle Atlantic, in the Glorious Revolution in England really settled a lot of the scores that had developed and rifts that had developed in the New World in the Atlantic seaboard. So very important changes going on. But before 1688, we've got these, more sort of atomized forces happening and changing things in the Atlantic seaboard. So I didn't intend to really get off on that tangent, but I did. Sorry about that. So the English took over prior to the Glorious Revolution, and they would eventually, wind up claiming the entire English seaboard. But after they took over New Netherland, they realized that sort of the diversity was not a problem. It was not something that was have to be forced out. So anyway, I'm stalling out. So anyway, here we go. Let's talk a little bit about the location and the physical geography of this area. Of course, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. Now, Delaware would actually start out as part of Pennsylvania, and it would be cut off later as its own colony. But here's something that's important about the Middle Atlantic. It's the least British of the United States Atlantic seaboard. It's the least British of the so-called English seaboard. Okay? So we have this area of the Hudson Valley that's referred to as New Netherland and New Sweden. Sweden is a power in Europe during the 1630s. It was an imperial power during the 30 Years' War. So we don't think of Sweden too much as being, aggressive and expansive, but the Swedes established a beachhead basically in the Delaware Valley, and they would bring in, they would have very little success in attracting Swedes to the New World. The only people that really came into New Sweden, this little tiny area in the Delaware River Valley, were fur traders and not many of them, fur traders and military men. So it was largely a military outpost, but they couldn't get Swedes to go to the New World. So what they did was they brought in settlers from an area that they had taken over in Finland and what is today Russia. So these people were actually the ones that made the difference. An area in uh, what is today northwestern Russia called Karelia, and the other groups were from Savo. Anyway, we refer to them as Savo-Karelians. Anyway, that was an area that had been colonized by Finns. Okay, so the New Sweden should probably be called New Finland. This was an area that was colonized by war captives or prisoners of war who were transported to the New World and directed to produce food, produce agriculture for the troops in New Sweden. All right, and so it's an odd area, but with some important ramifications. And then in the 1680s, early 1680s, we have the establishment of Pennsylvania, which is a very large area given to William Penn because of his connections and actually some debts owed to his father. And so it winds up getting what we call a proprietary colony, a proprietary land grant. In a sense, the crown gives Penn this huge amount of land to do with as he pleases. Now, William Penn, as I think I mentioned, was a Roundhead. He was a Puritan. He was a military man during the English Civil Wars. And he had a change of heart after the English Civil War. After things had settled down, he converted to Quakerism. All right, became a Quaker. And as a Quaker, he became a pacifist. And so William Penn decided that his colony in the New World would be a refuge for Quakers. And that's what Pennsylvania initially was this place where Quakers were welcome. Now, Quakers at the time were not tolerated very well. In fact, Quakerism was outlawed in Massachusetts and the New England colonies, and Quakers were expelled and run out of town. So they were considered intolerable in New England. But these folks would eventually wind up coming to New Jersey and into Pennsylvania later. All right, a little bit on the physical geography of the Middle Atlantic. All right. One of the sort of the most important aspects of the coast in this area are estuaries. Estuaries are essentially the mouths of rivers that had been inundated by the sea. This is an area that has actually as the sea levels have risen, they've flooded areas that were deltas back during the Ice Age. So this is where you have some really good port facilities all the way from the Tidewater area up to New England. So this is an area of estuaries, and they're not all equal. By far the best one is New York, and in New York we have a river valley called the Hudson River Valley that flows for the most part north to south, and way up in the northern part of the Hudson Valley is another river valley that essentially meets the Hudson at about a 90-degree angle. And so the Hudson River Valley is a almost linear north-south valley that's been carved out by glaciers. So it is what we call a glacial trough. It's a very rounded, deep valley, and especially as you get down toward closer to New York City, the valley is very deep and is a tidal estuary, meaning that salt water comes in and goes out. So this is an area that where large ships can go far up the Hudson Valley. So it's New York Harbor, of course, is one of the larger and well-protected natural harbors, very deep water port. The Hudson River Valley is this broad, straight glacial trough ending in a tidal estuary. And it's accessible all the way to Troy, New York, which is 153 miles north of New York City. So ocean-going ships can go easily up into this valley. And then the Mohawk Valley connects it to the, well, with the Erie Canal, 1820s, would connect the Hudson Valley to the Great Lakes system. But the Mohawk Valley was strategic. That's the valley that the Iroquois, and the Mohawk included, the Iroquois Confederation controlled, and they didn't allow settlement into the Mohawk Valley until much later. So the Dutch were wise to establish good relationships with the Iroquois. As I said last time, they were free traders. They didn't have a paternalistic attitude toward the native peoples like the French did, or perhaps even the Spanish in some ways. So this area, the Hudson Valley, is very, very attractive to the Dutch. The Dutch picked a very, very good location to establish themselves. And of course, you probably know about the story about, the Dutch purchasing Manhattan Island for what, $16 or $24 or something like that. They were crafty and got established there. The other primary estuary that I need to talk about is the Delaware Valley, and that's south. That's the broad, sort of triangular-shaped estuary that was the delta or the mouth of the Delaware River. The Delaware River flows up to where Philadelphia is today. Well, I should say Philadelphia was located on the Delaware River for that reason. Now, the Delaware River is different than New York Harbor in that it's a very shallow estuary with sandbars. It's not good for commerce. It's not a good location for a port, and never became a very good port site at all. But this was the area that the Swedes were established in. So I'll show you some maps later. Now, inland from the Delaware Valley, we have the southeast Pennsylvania area, and this would be the area that attracted settlers after the 1680s, late 1680s. And this was some of the very best farmland within the entire Atlantic seaboard. So when it comes to agricultural land, there's no place along the Atlantic seaboard that is better than, and I'm talking about the whole area to the east of the Appalachian Mountains. There's no single area that can rival southeastern Pennsylvania. And there's a reason for that. Anybody have any idea why? Southeast Pennsylvania had an enormous amount of very good farmland because it was primarily an area of limestone bedrock and rolling topography, relatively flat topography in some areas, but very good soils. And it also had mixed types of forests, deciduous hardwood forests. Unlike some similar places, New Jersey, for example, would not be settled very intensively very early because it was for the most part sandy and covered with pine forests, which made for relatively acidic, poor quality soils. Anyway, well, I can't really say much more about that until we see some maps. Now, there was an area that I guess if there was a rival to the area of southeastern Pennsylvania, it was the Great Valley, or the Ridge and Valley area, which began in southeast Pennsylvania and extended down all the way to Tennessee and even Alabama. So we'll see about that in a little bit. So here's something that's very important. Pennsylvania, southeastern Pennsylvania in particular, would be the point of origin, or sort of the arrival zone, for many of the people who would migrate into the upland south through Virginia, through the back country of Virginia and what is today Tennessee, and that would become a very important migration stream prior to 1800. We'll talk more about that. Okay, so let's look at a map, a physical geography type of map of this area that I'm talking about. I've outlined in purple, for the most part, the area that I want you to be concerned with, and this is the area that is important in terms of settlement and the areas for the period that we're concerned with, the area that would receive most of its settlement prior to 1775 or so, 1750. Notice that this map will be very different from that other one I showed you that included New York and the New England area. Don't ever think of New York as being in New England, okay? If you understand the Yankees-Red Sox rivalry, you would never do that, okay? So anything, this is New York over here on the east side of the Hudson Valley, but culturally it is, kind of a pretty stark changeover right here. Once you get west of the Hudson Valley, you're definitely in New York, all right? And so this area, we'll talk about the English in the Massachusetts Bay Area. We'll talk about the English in Plymouth. We'll talk about the English in Providence and in New Haven and the Connecticut Valley, but not today. Today we're talking about the Dutch and the Swedes and the Finns and the Quakers. So it's a long period, but of course New York Harbor is here. This would be New Amsterdam, established as New Amsterdam. The Dutch would colonize up the Hudson all the way up to about, that's Troy right there, if you can see the little T. And this is why I have the camera situated the way I do today. So hopefully you can see me pointing on these things. But basically Albany would become the area around Albany and Troy would become the sort of the outpost for the Dutch. It would be referred to as Fort Orange. Okay, so Dutch, Orange power. Okay, so I guess we're sort of Dutch around here at OSU. We're orange. So that the orange or the area of around Albany up here at the head of the Hudson Valley, what happens is once you get a little farther north, then what happens to the drainage system right here? There's a drainage divide. And what you're looking at, you can't really see it on this map, but this river is going to be flowing north into Lake Champlain, okay? So Lake Champlain, and you probably are familiar with Burlington, Vermont and the University of Vermont. Lake Champlain would then connect up with the St. Lawrence. So this was French and Indian territory. So this is in many ways both a political barrier for the expansion of the Dutch and later the English. And of course, this is a very, very rugged area of New England, and it has absolutely no value in terms of agricultural land, really. So it's not attractive to the New England Yankees later on. This is why New Englanders, for the most part, became commercial, mercantile oriented towards the ocean and the coast and the shipping trade, the carrying trade. And those people who did go west from New England generally went to New York. And so New York did become Yankeefied during the 18th century. This is an area that was colonized for the most part, and this is a bit later, but colonized for the most part by New Englanders. And New England would continue to have very important influences on upstate New York. But for now, we're talking about the Dutch, and mostly in this zone right here. I'll show you a different map. So this is the Dutch, and then the Swedish colony, New Sweden, is for the most part located right along this estuary, mostly on the New Jersey side. Okay, so the Swedes are colonizing this flat coastal plain along the Delaware Valley. Here's Wilmington, Delaware today, the boundary of Delaware and Pennsylvania, but earlier this was all just claimed by Pennsylvania. But Pennsylvania didn't come until 1681. So prior to that, the Swedes were in here. So the Swedes were only there from about 1638 until the English took over in about 1655. So New Sweden gets established right here, 1638. Very, very short amount of time. Here's another map, another way of looking at things. And I'm going to talk about the native peoples. I did mention that the Middle Atlantic colonies, New York, New Sweden, New Netherland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, had relatively, in relative terms, better relationship with the native peoples. A lot of that has to do with the fact that there weren't a lot of native peoples. All right. By this time, by the early or mid 1600s, populations of native peoples in this zone that I've shaded, which is the area we're talking about, native peoples had largely dispersed, primarily because of disease, depopulation, and as you recall from the Iroquois-Algonquian rivalry, in the Huron rivalry, it was an area of pretty intense warfare and violence. So a lot of the native peoples in this area had actually scattered to other areas to the interior and to the north. The Delaware, for example, there are a few tribal names up here. The Seneca, of course, are part of the the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Tuscarora, and Oneida, and the Mohawk are part of the Iroquois Confederation. And those actually let's see, I think it's the Tuscarora. The Tuscarora were originally down here, but they moved up to the north. So you have the Confederacy, the Iroquois Confederacy, which is a significant barrier to the movement of Europeans into the Mohawk Valley. The Delaware, and they would continue to be fairly strong, so they're kind of the exception. The Delaware would be dispersed largely. The Shawnee is another group. If you recognize some of these tribes, these are the Delaware and the Shawnee in particular are groups that have numerous tribal bodies today. Even in Oklahoma, there are 3 different groups of Shawnees. Right? There's 3 different Shawnee tribes, and there are more up in Kansas and Iowa. So there are Shawnees today over in southwestern Oklahoma in Caddo County and Anadarko area, and then they're the Western Shawnees, and then there are the absentee Shawnees down around Shawnee, Oklahoma, west of Oklahoma or east of Oklahoma City, and then there was another group of Shawnees up in Ottawa County in northeastern Oklahoma. So the Shawnees were one of these groups like the Delaware who, kind of like when you take a drop of mercury and pop it, and it just goes into all these pieces. That's kind of what happened to some of these groups like the Delaware and the Shawnee. So some groups scattered. Other groups like the Delaware wound up becoming sort of minorities within other tribal groups. Shawnees were like that too. When the Cherokees arrived into Oklahoma, into Indian Territory, there were Delawares and Shawnees living among them. They were sort of the minority within the tribe. We don't talk a lot about that, but all of the tribes had different groups. The Choctaws and the Chickasaws had a contingent of Shawnees. living among them. So anyway, these are this is a region where native peoples had been hit hard by disease and warfare, and were not very strong, not very well organized against colonization. That's one reason why native peoples had pretty good relations with the European settlers. But the better reason is that the colonists were a bit different in their attitudes. We'll talk about that. Largely because of William Penn and William Penn's ability to control settlement and manage settlement to some degree. Okay, so the Iroquois Confederacy has control of the Great Lakes fur trade. They're powerful. Okay, thank you so much. And Pennsylvania, you have this area of smaller tribes, weaker tribes. I probably haven't mentioned it in here, but the very first treaty between an Indian tribe and the infant United States was in 1778, and it was a treaty between the United States and the Delaware, or the Lenape. All right. So severe population decline in this general zone and westward migration, particularly south of the Iroquois Confederacy, this area here. So we call this kind of an indigenous shatter belt, an area that has been disrupted big time, and where a lot of people had migrated away from. So migration out of the area into the Ohio country. Now, in the early federal period, and in the period of the Articles of Confederation prior to 1800, the United States would be involved in Indian wars out here. Okay, so if you're familiar with the Confederacy that emerged in the Ohio country, what was the name of that Confederacy? Exactly, Tecumseh. Yeah, Tecumseh was the leader, and his brother, known as the Prophet, was sort of the spiritual leader. And but they were a hodgepodge of different groups. We usually think of them as Shawnee. They were Shawnee, but they were actually organizing a confederacy of numerous other groups of people who had all been displaced for the most part from this part of the world. So the Confederacy under Tecumseh is, for the most part, a British, allied group who looked to expel, the Europeans from their country. That's way on down the line. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that. So this north of the Ohio shatter belt area is a lot of refugee groups who would continue to be pushed to the west. There's a really good book by a historian on this whole movement of sort of refugee tribes all the way toward Chicago and that area, called Powhatan's Mantle. Okay, if you ever get a chance, it's really interesting. But it has nothing to do really so much with Powhatan down here. Okay, so this is a map. This is an extraordinary map in my mind, or in my opinion, of the Dutch and in New York, and the relationships with the Iroquois. This map is from, of course, it's the base map is by Irwin Royce. It looks like Irwin Race, but Irwin Royce, who is a cartographer. But the map with the other stuff is by Donald Meinig. Donald Meinig is probably the most well-known or respected historical geographer of our time, and at least of the late 20th century. And anyway, this particular map shows the area, and this is from his first volume in his 4-volume set called oh man, all right, I ought to know it because it's on my shelf. Uh, the man, what is the deal? It's just one of those. Oh, it's Dumb Monday. That's what it is. It's Dumb Monday. I have occasional Dumb Mondays. So uh, today's a Dumb Monday. No, today's Tuesday. Okay, Stupid Tuesday. All right. Uh, uh, the Shaping of America. Okay, so he's got this 4-volume set called The Shaping. It has these fantastic maps in it. Hopefully, I'll give you some more maps. But anyway, this is a map out of his section on the Dutch, and so here's the area colonized by the Dutch, and then later the British. So all of this area is, for the most part, what we refer to as the Hudson Valley. Any of you ever traveled up the Hudson Valley? Like, if you ever get a chance to go to um, to drive between New York City metropolitan area up to Albany. Do that in the fall of the year, and you won't be sorry. This is an absolutely gorgeous area of the East Coast. Not only that, but it's a broad glaciated trough or glacial trough, and it's just unique. Now the Dutch are colonizing through here, and what you're looking at here, I mean, the shaded area is indicative of the settlement up to about 1750, according to Meinig. And even though it looks like it must be colonized by people, it's really not the case. It's not an area that has very dense settlement. This is an area that was colonized by the Dutch in a system known as the patroon system. All right. So you've learned about the seigneurial system of the French. You've learned about the encomienda system of the Spanish. Now you've got a new one. The Dutch system of land tenure that they initially attempted in the Hudson Valley was called the patroon system. Patroon. Patroon. And it looks like patron, right? It looks like, and that's essentially what it means. The patroon system was it was a settlement scheme in which the Dutch company would dole out large land holdings to wealthy investors known as patroons. So these are Dutch Dutch capitalists, financiers, and they would own this land with the intent that they would bring in settlers and make it productive. So basically, it's a way of handing land out with the intention that people will attract farm settlement. Now the patroon system had, I'll give you some more information about it, but maybe you've read a little bit about it. How did it work? I've mentioned quit rents already, right? We've talked a little bit about a quit rent, and that is sort of an obligation to settlers to work every year on improving the roads or whatever the transportation infrastructure is. And this was part of that feudal system that was required or that was transferred over from Europe. Anyway, the quit rent and the patroon system created land holdings, established some land holdings that were contiguous to one another for the most part, very large estates of land, but the patroons themselves rarely put much effort into creating farms. What they did was they tried to lease the land out, but there were generally no takers. All right, and this would become a common pattern. So in the Eastern Seaboard, in the Europeanizing Atlantic seaboard of North America, we are continuously running into the same problem. While in Europe, there is a shortage of land, but a surplus of labor, okay? In the New World, there's a surplus of land and a shortage of labor, okay? So land is always available and cheap. It's the labor that's the problem. In other words, getting settlers to the New World was a real chore in some of these areas, particularly in New France and particularly in the Hudson Valley. They couldn't get people to come to the New World to become farmers. Why is that? Well, the type of agriculture that developed in this area was not specialized. It was nothing other than basic subsistence production. Eventually, they would grow some wheat. There would be some wheat production and some dairy production, but there was not a lucrative money-making incentive for people to come across the Atlantic, leave their homelands, and settle in this new area on some great adventure that would probably not pay very well. Number two, the other reason is that, to get to the New World, first of all, you had to have some capital in the first place. You had to be able to pay for it. Otherwise, you were probably going to have to lease your labor out for a few years as an indentured servant. Some people did that. However, the problem was once they arrived to the New World, there were just too many opportunities to remain in that relationship of being a laborer for somebody for 6 years. And so anyway, there were a lot of other distractions. It's kind of like, the distractions in the classroom. So there's a lot more fun things to do once you get here, right? So this is a problem, and it would continue to be a problem. So the result is that in the Hudson Valley, you had this pretty good land, but not really something that there was not really an agricultural staple that could make everybody a lot of money. The fur trade was there, yeah, sure. But people in Holland were not, number one, they weren't politically oppressed. This is an area of, where economic liberalism is thriving. People are doing really well back in Holland. So there wasn't this, demand for escaping the place. And for the most part, people didn't have much of an incentive to arrive. So what happened? Well, these patroonships that got started in the 1630s, 1640s, for the most part, continued on to hold the land after the English took over in the 1650s. And so you would have these landed estates owned by these old Dutch families. So after a couple of generations, you've got landholding families who didn't have really much of an incentive to capitalize on the land, and they couldn't get people to pay rent to farm it. So what did they do? They just held on to the land, and they allowed squatters, they allowed non-landowners and people who didn't pay the rent to come in and live on the land and actually made it productive. So this was an area, the Hudson Valley was initially colonized legitimately by these patroons who owned the land, who then just sort of let it go and allowed squatters, allowed illegal settlement to develop the land. So they were, they didn't demand their rent money. They pretty much just ignored it. And so this was an area that attracted lots of poor Englishmen later, lots of Yankees who came into this area and set up their farms here. Now, eventually, once they established farms, then perhaps they could purchase that land from the patroons, from the large landowners. And not all of the land was taken up in patroonships. just most of it, and maybe I can find a good map of it for you. But for the most part, this was an area that was kind of lax, if I could say that. It was good land that was really not under a lot of authority, not under a lot of control. It was owned, but yet the people who farmed it started off, for the most part, as squatters, as illegal settlers. Okay, illegal settlement, illegal settlement. Now let's switch over to a different area. Let's talk a little bit about this zone. To the west of New York City, or of New Amsterdam, would become a refuge for religious dissidents from Europe. And as I mentioned, and not only Europe, but also from New England. The Quakers. The Quakers were considered to be kind of a radical group. They were radical in the sense that they were pacifists. How else were the Quakers different? Well, I think maybe there's a lot of confusion with Quakers and Shakers, but the Shakers actually were a spinoff of the Quakers. Shakers were a bit different, though. They were very much a pious communal group. The Quakers weren't. The Quakers were different in the sense, in the way that they worshipped. They did not have they didn't have a really set liturgy. They were spontaneous, and they didn't call their churches churches. They called them meeting houses, and so they were different, and they weren't tolerated very well by Protestant groups and the Puritans in particular. So the Quakers were, for the most part, they believed in peace and getting along with your neighbor and tolerance. And so Pennsylvania became an attractive place. William Penn himself, being a Quaker, attempted to bring in these religious dissidents so that they could settle and do fine. For some reason my camera went off. Okay, so who knows what I missed there. All right, so the Quakers come into New Jersey, and they're establishing themselves. Before the Quakers, however, I got to remember, we've got a group down here. We've got the Swedes and the Finns down here. All right, so let's go back to this. This is a map of settlement over time, and I really just want you to be concerned mostly with, you can't see the entire map legend here, but the darkest areas are settled before 1650. Okay, so and it's kind of washed out on this thing, but you've got the New York City area settled fairly early on, and then you've got the Hudson Valley up here. Let me see if I can fix that a little bit. Maybe you can see this a little bit better. I'll move it up. Whoop. Yeah, we'll just do, okay, so we'll just ruin the slide. This lighter shade. This is getting pretty comical today. So, it seems like they're really arguing with one another today for some reason. I'm not sure why. So, anyway, this area is 1650 to 1700. This was before 1650. So let's do some control or some Command Z and go back to where we were. Okay, so. Okay, so before 1650, and then 1650 to about 1700 is this general area here. So you've got some beachheads right here. So this is before 1650. This is New Sweden right here. This little chunk, New Sweden. This is Dutch. You've got two areas of the Dutch. One is right around the the tri-state area, as they call it today, and then another one up here along the Hudson. So they start off as two different regions, and then you've got New Sweden down here. So, and then I want you to notice that between 1650 and 1700, which is the first 2 decades of Pennsylvania's establishment, Pennsylvania gets established 1681, but it settled pretty rapidly compared to any other place before it. And Pennsylvania then would basically expand. Pennsylvania would expand outward from this Philadelphia hearth. So this area would become the early area of Pennsylvania development, and then settlement after 1700 would extend this way. Okay, but right now we're before 1700, so there are no Germans coming in yet, no Scotch-Irish coming in yet, as would happen later. Here we've just got the Swedes and some Finns. Now, if we look at this zone, this is a type of, this is the economy up to about 1800. You have two zones here that I want you to be aware of, and that is this. This is a historian's map, so it's not real. It's pretty generalized, and you've got, for the most part, an area of tidewater tobacco production going on by the mid 1700s. But up here, tobacco, you can't grow tobacco, so you can't. It's not a commercially viable plantation crop. So, right around where Philadelphia and Delaware, that zone is where you have the boundary zone between the southern plantation economy, initially based in tobacco, and what we call a free soil general farming area. So which one is richer at this time? Well, there's a lot more money being made down here in 1750 than there is up here. This is an area that has good farmland, but it's producing food. And that would be the case. So here's another important aspect of the Middle Atlantic. It would become the first breadbasket of the Atlantic seaboard. Now there was some decent land up here in the Connecticut Valley, but there were some agricultural areas along the Narragansett lowlands, that area. But nothing would compare in terms of good farmland to this zone right here, between the Susquehanna and the Delaware Valley. Right there, that's some of the very best land of all. If you've ever seen, did you ever see that movie Good Will Hunting? It was probably made before you were born. What's the actor? Is it Matt Damon? Okay. Matt Damon plays this sort of brilliant guy, right? He comes from a working class Boston background, South Boston, and in the movie, you remember he's at Harvard, I guess it is, right? So there's a lot of great, sort of Harvard jokes going on in that movie. But one of them, early on in the movie, he goes to the bar. It's where he meets the woman, the woman that he falls in love with, and she's with this history graduate student, the long hair. Remember that? The long blonde hair, pretty boy guy. Sorry, that's a term I used when I was growing up. It's pretty boy. But anyway, he was kind of a pretty boy, and he was, the well-connected Harvard, history graduate student. And here's Good Will Hunting, and they're talking about, I don't know. Do you remember the scene? You know what I'm talking about? Where basically the guys, the long-haired pretty boy guys, is talking about, trying to throw his weight around, like, because he's throwing out like history facts and stuff, and Will goes up and basically he's grown up on a public library budget, but he's read a lot more than this guy ever did, and in that movie, maybe I'll link this. In that movie, he refers to James T. Lemon, and in that little argument that they had, he refers to James T. Lemon, who is a historical geographer who has written mostly on southeastern Pennsylvania, and one of his book is actually called The Best Poor Man's Country. And anyway, that little spat was mentioned an actual historical geographer in that area. Anyway, it's kind of That's a trivia fact, I guess. But we'll come back next time, and I'll let you go here, and we'll talk maybe a little bit more about New Sweden and the impact that I didn't think we'd get to it, but New Sweden had on the rest of the country, and it's pretty fascinating. So look forward to seeing you on Thursday.